I hired a contractor to install drywall in my basement music studio, along with resilient channels for the ceiling. Unfortunately, I'm still hearing a lot of impact noise from things like footsteps, so I've decided to completely rebuild the ceiling. What I found when I pulled everything down was even worse than I expected.
It's a complete waste of time and money for everybody.
Watch as I pull apart the ceiling and discover multiple errors in the installation. This is why you shouldn't trust your contractor with soundproofing. To start the demolition, I scored the edge of the ceiling where it meets the walls. This way I could rip out the ceiling as I go without damaging the drywall on the walls. With the edges prepped, I switched to a shop light and removed the light fixture before pulling out a hammer to break open a hole in the drywall. I discovered very quickly though that 2 layers of 5/8 drywall is just too thick for this technique, and I would have to try something different. I tried a multi-tool, but this was quite slow, so I switched to a handheld circular saw. I was trying to avoid using a circular saw because it's incredibly messy, but it seemed to be the only way forward. This was much more effective, and I was able to start pulling out larger sections of drywall. But once I got the first section out, I discovered the first problem with the contractor's installation.
Alright, so if you've watched any of my other videos, you know that I've talked about Acoustics. I talked about that in the last video about drywall and air sealing. And what is supposed to be done when you install drywall is between each layer, you put Acoustics. Now, if the contractor had actually installed Acoustics, you would see the big mess that it leaves behind right here. But this is perfectly clean. There's no signs of any Acoustics being used, which is just another frustration. That drywall contractor wasn't very good. Another issue is that when you're using resilient channels, you don't want any of the screws to go into these joists. Otherwise, it defeats the whole purpose of resilient channels. Now, I had a whole conversation with the contractor about which screws to use. You can see that there's a hole right there, that if a screw is in there, it goes right into this joist. We didn't use screws that were short enough, and I tried to explain to them to go around. I even left marks on the sidewall about where the joists are, but they obviously weren't very careful. So they weren't careful about where the screws went, and they didn't use the Acoustics in between the layers.
After removing a bit more of the ceiling, I found a perfect example of why acoustic sealant is so important.
Okay, so if you want to know why the air sealing is recommended with something like acoustic seal or another acoustic caulk, it's because there's actually a really big gap between this layer. So at this spot, all the way along here, it's not actually 2 layers of drywall. It's just one because you have this huge hole there. So when you fill it with acoustic caulking, you stop that air gap and you keep each layer consistent. You have what looks like maybe an 1/8 inch gap over 8 feet. So think about how big that hole is. So when this continues through the whole ceiling, it really gets in the way of acoustic isolation.
And very quickly after, I found a third installation problem.
Here's another issue. So you can see that both layers of drywall were put in first before the sidewalls. What you want is one continuous layer, walls and ceilings, all the way around the room first. Fill it, all the gaps and all the seams with acoustic caulk, and then you put on the next layer. This gap here is consistent all the way through. None of these things seem like a big deal on their own, but they add up. All right, so look at this. Our first evidence of acoustic seal. Maybe they misunderstood. Maybe they just thought it needs to go around the perimeter only, but at least they did use it somewhere. That's something.
I continued pulling apart the ceiling, moving a little faster now that I was comfortable with the method. I cut long lines with the circular saw, and the first layer came off the screws with a little tugging. For the second layer, I had to remove the screws. At this stage, I had my first access to a complete resilient channel and could begin removing some of those. A little further, and I discovered that not all drywall pieces were layered correctly.
So there's another issue right here. These two pieces are cut and they almost line up at the exact same spot. You want to overlap all the seams so that, like this. So you got a cut here. You want the next piece to fully overlap it. This is too close. It's too easy for sound to pass through both gaps there into the room.
You can see how incredibly dusty this job is. Before I started, I closed the HVAC and covered all the plugs, switches, and diffusers with painter's tape. Even with the doors closed, some dust traveled outside the room because the doors aren't sealed yet. In just a moment, I will discover the biggest problem yet.
All right, so check this out. You have a resilient channel. They attached it onto the stud here, and it's going over here directly underneath a stud. And I'm not sure if you can see it, but there is a screw right in there. So what is the point of resilient channels to decouple from the structure if you're just going to have a screw go directly into a stud? It's a complete waste of time and money for everybody. So be warned, if you're working with a contractor, you might be better off putting these in yourself, choosing which parts you do, which the contractor does. And if the contractor's doing it, make sure you check their work. This is brutal. What a waste of money. On this piece alone, I took out one, there's two, and there's three. All of them going directly into the studs. The whole point of the resilient channels is that you have the screws. Screws are supposed to go through this lower part, and they're about 1/2 inch tall. So the screws are supposed to go through this and no further. I'm honestly not even sure which screws they were using. We got fine thread screws for use with the resilient channels, but these are coarse thread. No wonder I've been having issues when they put so many screws directly through into the structure.
By the end, I discovered a total of 5 screws that went directly into studs. Given the number of screws that I removed before pulling out the second layer of drywall, I'm sure I would have found many more.
All right, we got another issue. What you're supposed to do is actually overlap the resilient channels. You could potentially have them flex or butt it up against each other in such a way that it makes these more rigid than they otherwise would be. If you overlap them, they're not going to be poking at each other. These particular ones look fine because they're actually spread apart, so you shouldn't have that. Look how close this is. This is actually putting pressure on the resilient channels. So you might be making them stiffer by doing that. If you overlap it, you don't have that pressure of them pushing up against each other.
In all, there were 3 critical mistakes the contractor made. Contractor didn't use acoustic sealant on all seams. Some screws went through resilient channels into studs, and the contractor didn't provide enough overlap on some drywall seams. I used a contractor to save time, and I was working while they did the installation, so couldn't check their work often enough. With the time and money I'm investing to rebuild this ceiling, it would have been cheaper to take an extra day or 2 off work to be more closely involved in the installation process. Next step is to build the new ceiling, this time using isolation clips similar to the ones I used for the walls. To see the wall installation, click here.